Hello, my name's Jack Nurse, and I am the director of REFUGE by Matthias Haraldsson, which was to be on at the Cut the Cord new Nordics Festival earlier this year. As part of the project, I was fortunate enough to go on a trip to Iceland on a sort of culture exchange where I met Matthias, I met other theatre makers and writers working there, and I also met artists working in the main theatre organisations and buildings in Reykjavik, Iceland's capital. And during this workshop, I'm going to just touch on a bit of background about Icelandic culture and the theatre scene in Reykjavik. I'm going to talk about the theatre that I saw on my trip, and I'll go through a couple of exercises that came from conversations with Matthias and thinking just a wee bit about what we can learn from theatre culture in Iceland moving forward. So, the National Theatre of Iceland. The main building opened in 1950 and it houses a main cross-arch stage. It has a loft space that's currently used for puppet theatre for children, but will be developed into a lab space and a sort of basement space downstairs where sort of gigs, stand-up, cabaret, lots of different types of events happen throughout the month and brings different audiences in. So that's the main building. And at the National Theatre, there's also a black box studio dedicated to children's theatre that has two different spaces in a building separate but just across the street to the main building. So whilst I was in Iceland, I met Greta, a dramaturg at the National Theatre. And Greta runs her own company, Starta Benda, for which she won Best Newcomer at the Icelandic Theatre Awards in 2017. So Greta is relatively new to her role, and that fact is emblematic of a few different people I met during my trip who are fresh blood, invigorating their respective organisations with new thoughts and experiences. Greta's interested in gender studies and the comparisons between the queer community and Brechtian theatre. She cites kind of comparisons between epic theatre and drag. And Greta, she was kind of indicative of the kind of interrogative culture of different theatre people that I met on my trip, gently questioning and probing the politics of a piece, and also more widely the sort of role of theatre in contemporary society. In terms of the National Theatre, Greta described there being a shift in the theatre's programming in recent years between adaptations and onto a sort of focus on platforming new work and new writing. There is one open production a year, and what they mean by open is essentially is a kind of mass appeal, accessible production that will get bums on seats. And 2 years ago, the Icelandic government changed the law about the National Theatre. It was kind of like a charter, changing the old focus that said we need X, Y, Z amount of productions per year, like X ballet, a certain amount of ballet per year, etc. And it changed it to more freedom, so that programmers and ADs could focus on different types of theatre that respond to now. So I found that really interesting. And speaking about the artistic director, Magnus Geir Thordsson is the artistic director of the National Theatre. He was artistic director of the City Theatre, Iceland's other major producing house, which I'll talk about in a moment. And he was at the City Theatre, then he moved to broadcasting, and then he moved back to theatre as AD of the National Theatre of Iceland, beginning early this year in January 2020. And I heard during my trip that hopes are high that Magnus's new leadership at the National Theatre will act as a catalyst and have the same transformative effect he seemingly had at the City Theatre. Greta spoke about Magnus's reign at the National Theatre still being in its infancy, but she spoke of a shift with this appointment, that there's hope of long-lasting effects on the culture of Icelandic theatre, with both main theatres in Reykjavik soon benefiting on Magnus's ability to pull in large audiences, and also benefiting from his focus on platforming new talent as well. So it felt like an exciting moment in sort of the history of Icelandic theatre, and specifically theatres in Reykjavik. Playing the main space at the National Theatre when I was there in February was a production of Network that was recently on at the National Theatre, the Ivo van Hove / Lee Hall adaptation. And that was one of a few examples of sort of British work that had come across to Iceland and been giving an Icelandic production. So the City Theatre, Reykjavik, lies slightly on the outskirts of the centre, whereas the National Theatre is literally on the high street. And the City Theatre has 3 different spaces. In truth, it sort of reminded me of London's National Theatre, with its kind of modern, flexible auditoria, modern foyer with restaurant and lots of space to mill about in. The City Theatre's programme includes 2 co-productions with external companies, and they programme lots of different types of shows, from new work to classics to musicals. Uncle Vanya was playing in Rep whilst I was there, and they had just finished a large-scale production of the RSC's Matilda adaptation in its main space. Again, an example of British work coming across. There are 2 to 3 new plays each year, not including devised pieces or adaptations, at the City Theatre, and it also programmes events such as talks and lectures. I met the dramaturg Kaflidi there, and his words, he said that they're trying to platform conversations about now. So, for example, they had a lecture about climate change that was on. I saw Skastrot, which translates as screenshot, whilst I was there, and it was broadly about fake news and AI and finding meaning in the modern world. I say that's what it was about. I had to read the copy afterwards because there was no English subtitles and I was just watching this lecture. But what was clear was the engagement of the audience, and that kind of priceless atmosphere of an attentive audience never dropping throughout the performance, even though it was only a lecture, it was only a presentation. But again, crucially, these lectures felt key to representing how theatre in Reykjavik was not only in conversation with itself, but also with wider culture and society. So Shanabeo is the leading independent venue in the city. In fact, one of the only professional independent venues. It's in the centre of Reykjavik, near to the busier tourist streets, but placed opposite a body of water, so there's a feeling of tranquility as you approach the building. Friedrich, the general manager, he took me into the studio at the beginning of our meeting, and he showed me the 180-seat black box theatre that also doubles up as a rehearsal space. So there was the main theatre, and there was another sort of like kind of cosy coffee shop type space next to it. And as the foremost independent venue in the city, I was interested in the programming of the theatre and its place in the wider ecology of the theatre and arts community in Reykjavik, and also its funding picture. It stages 10 shows a year with no more than 4-week runs, and it operates on a 3-year funding cycle which supports its staffing. So there are 2 pots of money in Iceland, project-based and one for running costs, and each year there are 20 projects-ish that are funded. But Friedrich was saying that as the number of projects funded has gone up, the money given out has gone down because the pot of money itself has stayed the same. So just a couple of examples of work going on elsewhere in Iceland. A theatre company called Leek Hopperin Lotter, who specialise in outdoor and children's shows, felt like a prominent example of a theatre company. They've been working together for 13 years, and they're worth checking out. And I also came across the Freezer, which was a hostel and art centre on the West Peninsula of Iceland, self-described as the cultural crown of West Iceland. So it's a recycled, renovated fish factory that now operates as an arts and cultural space combined with a hostel. And the theatre performances are staged in English, and it's the only cultural centre in West Iceland, so it holds a fascinating place in the wider cultural sector of the country. In Iceland, audience attendance is the highest in the world per capita, although one person I met joked that Iceland is the highest in the world of everything per capita. Although later in my trip, I did get the sense that Iceland faces the same battle as UK theatre makers and organisations of attracting audiences without financial and marketing muscle. For example, I met an independent theatre maker that mentioned his struggles in getting bums on seats for his show, despite its widespread praise and critical acclaim. The National Theatre offers a season ticket of 4 shows that is sort of the bulk of its audience attendance. So before we go on to the exercises and the work that I saw in Iceland, just want to talk briefly about theatre education in the country. During my trip, I met Steinunn, who is the Dean of Performance Arts at Iceland University of the Arts, and she ran a few courses, all of which every young theatre maker, writer, playwright that I met whilst I was there came from this university, had studied there, and knew Steinunn and had benefited from her education. And I just wanted to sort of, in this workshop forum, talk a bit about what she described, because whilst in this country there's seemingly lip service about arts education and performing arts education in drama schools / conservatoires, although there does seem to be new conversations happening with new appointments. Steinunn, for a decade or more, has been living and implementing the change that I definitely want to see. And she kind of described her job as being a supervisor or an enabler, not a teacher. She was trying, and seemingly successfully, from speaking to the people from her ex-students, to remove the hierarchy and remove the patriarchy from teaching in educational institutions, and also therefore its surrounding communities and ultimately the world. And she described her students as arriving as artists, that they don't become artists on the course. And there is an emphasis on collaboration across her faculties. She questions and probes her students. She doesn't give them answers. And in terms of assessment, Steinunn and the university tried not to enforce her or her staff's opinions, and instead have a group dialogue or one-on-one with a third party present, which she described as being much more powerful. And those sessions kind of constituted questions from the teachers or supervisors, and not telling them what they thought as is conventional, but trying to understand the student's perspective and lead from there. And that then leads to self-reflection and self-evaluation, so that the students can determine where they want to go and figure out the answers about their paths themselves, and therefore gifting them autonomy and cultivating self-independence. In other words, what it's like in the real world outside of an educational institution. So she started about a decade ago. She got rid of grades. She removed the idea of the teacher as a judge. She removed the agenda from the teacher and their actions. And all of these ideas really resonate. It's pass-fail at the University of Icelandic Arts. There's a written feedback from a committee at the end of the process, acting as a kind of status report. And other than that, it is a dialogue. Removing grades means that there's a focus, and the focus moves from the number of the grade or the letter of the grade to what the student is actually trying to do or is doing. And she compared grades to stars in reviews or social media. So Steiner was basically saying that we should use our resources better to question power structures. So even, for example, Steinunn as the dean doesn't have a private office. That was something she changed. Inclusivity, collaboration and sustainability are some of the other buzzwords that are in the conversation. But in short, I think Steinen is a brilliant progressive thinker who, on the surface at least from my visit, is doing really interesting things in terms of performing arts education that feels leaps and bounds beyond the majority of work achieved in the UK. So the first exercise I am going to share is one that a version of it will be familiar to a lot of us. Mattias Haraldsson, the writer of REFUGE, directed the original Icelandic version of the show a couple of years ago. And he told me in his rehearsal process he did some improvisation based on situations from the play. So briefly, I'll just go a wee bit into the play. REFUGE is about a 37-year-old man called Lawrence who loses his mother, and as a way of coping with his grief for that loss and for the loss of another relationship that he had that came to an end, as a way of dealing with those life events, he spends a night in IKEA. And IKEA, he mentions in the play, is his place of refuge. And Lawrence, he spends the night there. He hides up in the racks of the self-serve furniture area until the doors have closed and everyone has left. And he stays there overnight and contemplates his own mortality, his grief, and a wider sense of his relationship with the environment and the world. So Mattias had a guest actor come into rehearsals to play impromptu situations with the actor playing Lawrence. So REFUGE is a one-person show, which meant that having somebody come in fleshed out certain situations, certain relationships, events that are mentioned in the text to help the actor playing Lawrence. So these included where Lawrence met his mother, met other employees at IKEA, and other different situations like that, kind of quick experiments, and basically to see how Lawrence would react in those situations. So after the improv finished, there'd be a kind of follow-up discussion on what happened, and interrogating why he acted in a certain way in that particular situation. So these were interrogated to flesh out the different situations and the different relationships mentioned in the text. So this is a practical example of how to explore the backstory of a character, I guess, and kind of different events that are mentioned in a text and how to explore them. And whilst I didn't get a guest actor in when I was doing my production, that I rehearsed with Martin, Martin, the actor that played Lawrence, we did spend a lot of time discussing different versions of potential relationships and situations. And there's a phone call with Lawrence's mum in the piece where we only hear Lawrence's side, and me and Martin spent a lot of time making notes about what she's potentially saying on the other side of the line, some of which were straightforward choices, and others that became part of a much wider conversation about that mother-son relationship, which forms the bedrock of the play. And every decision we made during these conversations added up to a bigger picture of who Lawrence was. So it also added up to what his story is and what his relationships are. And this is incredibly important to do anyway, but particularly for a one-person show, where every action, every word of dialogue, and every feeling needs to be truthful and rooted in character. So when I was in Reykjavik, I was really fortunate enough to see a play called Club Romantica by Friedgeir in Arson. And it's about a theatre maker, Friedgeir, who finds a collection of photo albums in a Brussels flea market in 2008 and tries to track down the woman who the photos belong to. It's a really simple story, but beautifully told, with warmth and humanity and pathos. Club Romantica. It's a joy. It was a joy to watch it, even though I didn't have the opportunity to read the English translation beforehand, but I since have, and it's absolutely a wonderful bit of writing, and it would not have looked out of place in a fringe venue in the UK. And I say this because of its kind of direct address storytelling. There was live music. It was just Fried Gear and a second musician who also kind of did some lines at points as well, and projection behind to add to the kind of visual language of the piece. And in fact, it held kind of similar elements to stuff that I'm really interested in as well. People during my trip had raved about Club Romantica, so it was really, really great to see it. There was a kind of quiet, understated nature to the delivery of Fried Gear, which kind of drew the audience in, and I was struck by the way that they stayed engaged to that style, and there was a hugely, although the audience is quiet, there was moments of laughter, but really quiet and attentive. There was a hugely warm reception at the end for this production that had been away for a year and came back for a kind of run of performances at the City Theatre, and it was directed by Peter, that I met along with Hiflidi. And Peter, like Greta, was new into his role as a dramaturg at the City Theatre, and I literally met him and Hiflidi on literally day 2 or 3 of Peter's first week in his role at the City Theatre. Not exclusively, but I sense largely off the back of what had been a really successful show with Club Romantica. And I mentioned I also saw Skasjot, the presentation, and Haflidi and Peter were so extremely welcoming, and when I met them at the City Theatre, gifted me programmes for current shows, as well as tickets, and they also allowed me to enter the technical rehearsal of the City Theatre's upcoming production of Pinocchio, which I believe was or is titled Laurie, directed by Augusta Skula-Dottir. And I was only able to stay for less than an hour at the tech, but it did not feel dissimilar to a UK tech, although it did feel more relaxed. So the second exercise that I learnt during my trip to Iceland will be, again, familiar to a lot of you, but I found it really helpful in deepening the work on character in REFUGE. Again, this was also used by Matthias in his own rehearsal process for the original Icelandic production of REFUGE. So the way that Matthias facilitated his was through a writing exercise where everyone in the group, including himself, including the actor playing Lawrence and the dramaturg, everyone wrote down personal statements on behalf of the character Lawrence, and then read them out to each other. So the frame was quite simple, and there'd be a set time to complete the task, maybe 10 or 20 simple statements that all start with I am, I have, I want, I feel, etc. And those terms can be determined by the people working on each individual project, so they could be adapted to whatever the text is. So it felt useful to use for my own process on REFUGE. Matthias kind of spoke about it in terms of the character kind of speaking and getting a sense of all the different people in the room and their views on what the character might come out with, followed by a collective conversation revolving around those different ideas and viewpoints. I went for a slightly different version, which was to ask solely Martin, the actor playing Lawrence, halfway through the second week of rehearsals, so kind of the midpoint, to compile this list himself, and for us then to discuss it. So it was important by that point that for Martin to be thinking and feeling in character, and for that mindset to be becoming intrinsic, which is why I didn't complete the task. Afterwards, Martin and I then discussed the answers that he came up with. A character's thoughts about themselves are obviously crucial, and some practitioners, like Katie Mitchell, go into real depth and detail for these exercises. For me, in this particular moment for REFUGE, having heard particularly that Matthias used it in his process, the exercise acted as a sort of milestone where we moved from the early kind of exploratory part of the rehearsal process into something more refined and focused, pinning down our choices about character and motivations and relationships, etc. So just a wee bit about how Iceland influenced my production of REFUGE. REFUGE takes place in IKEA, as mentioned. And when I was in Reykjavik, I went with Matthias to the IKEA on the outskirts of the city. And it was the IKEA in which Matthias had in his head as he was writing the play. And it was really interesting to go there with him, and we had pretty much our first kind of creative conversations about the meat of the play in the IKEA cafe. And whilst pretty much every IKEA I've ever been to, including in Reykjavik, feels the same, it was important to have that conversation with Matthias in that place about not only what's written on the page, but also why he wrote it and what the emotional and sort of intellectual place that he was coming from was when he wrote the play, and why IKEA specifically. So that was really brilliant. And in terms of thinking about it as a translation as well, I went through a number of different versions of the show in terms of where it was going to be located. The translator and Matthias encouraged anyone who's going to interpret the text to locate it locally to where the play is being staged. In the end, I decided to keep it in Reykjavik rather than London because it felt very much like that choice was where we were going to get the most out of the play and the most out of the themes, and by keeping it in Reykjavik. Sometimes relocating things to different cultures and societies requires a bit more work, and crucially as well, it affects some of the choices the writer is making by moving it into a kind of different political, economic, social context. So decided to keep it in Reykjavik, and that decision was made after visiting IKEA and after visiting the place. I don't think I would have made that choice without doing that. And also, when I was in Iceland, I was listening to a lot of Icelandic music. So Sigur Rós is an obvious example, but also kind of Jóhann Jóhannsson, Hildur Guðnadóttir, who just won the Oscar for Joker. And those two latter artists in particular, I was listening to them as I was kind of going on a bus journey from the airport through the landscape for the first time, and seeing the environment and the natural surroundings that made up Iceland, and that sort of emotive, earthy music made sense. It was kind of evocative of that place of Iceland, and therefore an apt choice to kind of underscore this production of REFUGE that was going to be set in Iceland but would be staged in London. So it's really kind of beautiful music. So alongside it being able to emphasise and amplify certain moments or themes as used as composition, it is just as a standalone pieces of music just absolutely phenomenal, and I would encourage anyone to who hasn't heard this music to check it out. So what can we learn from theatre in Iceland? So I can only speak personally from my experience there. So what I kind of learnt, I sensed in Reykjavik a real pronounced distinction between our culture and British theatre making culture in its focus on children's theatre. So both the National Theatre of Iceland and the City Theatre that I mentioned clearly make space for regular young people's work. You don't, and you wouldn't see this, excuse me, at the National Theatre or the Young Vic in London, which is what I see as comparable venues for the National Theatre and the City Theatre. I guess it's something to do with the few theatres there are in Iceland or in Reykjavik do feel the need to cater for children's theatre. But even in Scotland, where I'm based, the kind of bigger companies in the National Theatre of Scotland don't put on children's theatre as a prerequisite or an automatic part of their programming. So it definitely felt that children's theatre is heralded and supported by the main theatre buildings in Reykjavik, and that felt like a real important cultural distinction and something that we could learn from. Another thing that I noticed, as I mentioned during the trip, was the recurrence of Icelandic theatres taking over work from the UK for their own productions. So the Network at the National Theatre, Matilda at the City Theatre, as I mentioned. And I question what would it be like if the transaction went both ways, if we looked not only to kind of German theatre, continental Europe, but to the Nordic countries for inspiration, and specifically Iceland in this example, and about learning from what those theatres and those artists have to offer. And finally, kind of what can we learn? A deep thinking, inquisitiveness, particularly about character and about themes, and also how theatre can strive to have a more meaningful interaction with society. As I mentioned, there's the kind of city theatre has talks and presentations and stuff, and it felt like, as I mentioned, it's not just in conversation with itself. It's not insular. It's outward looking, and it's actively outward looking as well. It's actively having a conversation with that society there. Yes, a smaller society, but can we learn from it? Yes, absolutely.